We are today here to mark, again, the 50th anniversary of Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique, published in 1963. And at this point in the program, I would like to introduce you to our keynote speakers. Kirsten Fermaglich.
That's okay.
Sorry.
It's okay.
And Lisa Fine come to us from Michigan State University, where they both teach in the history department. Associate Professor Fermaglich, who received her PhD from New York University, studies women's, Jewish, and ethnic history more broadly in the United States. She is the author of American Dreams and Nazi Nightmares, Early Holocaust Consciousness in Liberal America, published by Brandeis University Press. Her work appears in numerous scholarly journals and edited volumes, including American Jewish History and American Studies. She is currently researching a book on name changing in New York City in the 20th century, tentatively entitled A Rosenberg by Any Other Name. Dr. Fine, who received her PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, is currently serving as co-director of the Center for Gender in Global Context in International Studies and Programs at MSU. Her research focuses on the American working class and labor history, as well as women and gender in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Her work has appeared in the Journal of Social History and Labor History. She's the author of two books, The Souls of the Skyscraper, Female Clerical Workers in Chicago, 1870 to 1930, and The Story of Rio Joe, Work, Kin, and Community in Autotown, USA, both of them published by Temple University Press. For her next project, she's studying the relationship between the 20th century US working class and the land. Dr. Fermaglich and Fine are here to speak to us today about the book that you see here, the Norton Critical Edition of the Feminine Mystique, a tremendous volume published this year to mark the book's 50th anniversary, which they edited together. Now, for those of you who have not seen it, well, first of all, it's here on the table. I can tell you that it is quite impressive. As you will hear them talk about, it includes not just the book by Betty Friedan, but other important documents from the time period, as well as essays by historians and critics. So without further ado, please welcome Kirsten Fermaglich and Lisa Fine. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, can everyone hear me? Okay, good. So first, we'd really like to thank everyone for being here. This is an amazing audience. We'd really like to thank Joan and Francesca and Michelle for inviting us to speak and for organizing this fabulous seminar. We'd like to thank everyone at the Newberry for making this happen, to Liesl and to everyone who's been involved. It's been a really an amazing day, an amazing experience. We have been living with this book and with Betty Friedan for 2 years, so it is nice to find so many people who... 4 years? 4 years. 4 years. 4 years. There you go. 4 years. It went by. It's like having children. So it's been an amazing and very long experience. It is a pleasure to share it with so many people who feel so passionate about Betty Friedan. I mean, we've been doing it in our little bubble, and it's pretty incredible to be here with so many people who also want to be talking about Betty Friedan in such intellectually engaging and personally committed ways. So this is just a really amazing experience. We've been asked to talk about the process, the making of it. So a little bit of this talk is going to be a little bit more nuts and bolts than the other things that we heard this morning, which we were so impressed by. But we're also going to be engaging some of the intellectual questions too, and we hope that the Q&A will bring back some of that conversation, which we both found really intellectually productive. So first, I was going to introduce myself, but Michelle did such a wonderful job that I don't need to do it quite so much. My name is Kirsten Fermaglich. Jewish. I do study 20th century American Jewish history, so I came to Betty Friedan in a little bit of a side route. My current work is on the history of name changing. If people have an anecdote about their names being changed, I would love to hear that. But my first book, American Dreams and Nazi Nightmares, examined the works of 4 American Jewish intellectuals who used analogies of Nazi concentration camps to explore American liberal politics in the early 1960s. Or the turn of the 1960s, as I called it. And Betty Friedan was one of those intellectuals. I published an article on Friedan and the comfortable concentration camp in 2004. And that article put me in touch with Daniel Horowitz, who wrote a major biography of Friedan, who helped to support my work. And the combination of the article, my book, and my connections with Horowitz brought my name to the attention of Norton, who asked me to co-edit this volume because they were interested in putting something out to celebrate the 50th anniversary. And had I known how much work it would entail, I would never have said yes. But truly, I've been really grateful to Norton for selecting me for this. It was a tremendous honor, and it allowed me to delve more fully into Friedan's text and life than I otherwise would ever have done. So it's really just been an amazing journey. And I've also been grateful for Lisa Fine's participation in the project, because it would never have gotten done without her, which she knows. Norton's goal was to have a junior and a senior scholar work together. And in our case, I think that was crucial to helping it happen. They were very wise. And so I'm going to let Lisa introduce herself and talk more about her.
Right, so this is how we worked, back and forth, until we got it right. So that's what we'll do and mirror that today, or model that today. I'm Lisa Fine. My work focuses primarily on gender and labor in the 20th century Midwest right now. I've always been primarily interested from the moment I was in graduate school in trying to understand how women have dealt with the work-life balancing act in historical perspective. Certainly, I came to that from a personal, for personal reasons, but I was always very interested in trying to uncover that and understand that historically. So this has been a sort of an ongoing issue for me. My first book was on female clerical workers in Chicago during a very formative period in clerical work history in this city, and I lived here for 3 years. It was one of the most fun periods of my life. And my second book explored male auto workers in Lansing in the 20th century. My research now concerns the relationships between groups of working class people in Michigan and the natural world. I have not published on Friedan, but I did read her while I was in college, and I have a very vivid memory of that. I studied her when I was in graduate school at Wisconsin, and I have taught her pretty continuously as I taught the U.S. Women's History Surveys at Michigan State University for over 20 years. I've also used her work in my graduate classes, so I see her as a really key part of training women's and gender history in the United States. As Kirsten said, she was the reason I got this job, and it didn't take me very long to have to consider it to say yes. I just loved the opportunity to be able to delve into Friedan, her work, and her life, and this certainly gave me that opportunity. After I said yes to Kirsten, though, I realized I had a little work to do, and so I went to the library and I checked out every single book that Betty Friedan wrote. And I read them. And then I tried to familiarize myself with recent scholarly work that referred to her and her place in history. What I found, and this is interesting in light of the conversation this morning, I found that one of her last books that I was not that familiar with, The Fountain of Age, was surprisingly compelling. And I came to think that it was probably underrated. I really thought it was brilliant. Friedan's skills as a writer, as a researcher, as an intellectual became abundantly clear to me through this exercise. And it was doing this, reading her work as an author, as an intellectual, as a scholar, that provided a very interesting new insight for me about her. And it proved very important in the approach that Kirsten and I ended up taking to doing this Norton book.
All right. So after we sort of did initial separate sort of preparations for thinking about how to do this book, we sat down to discuss our collective approach over coffee. There was a lot of coffee always involved, and tea, yes. So first and foremost, we needed to understand what was expected of us working with the Norton Critical Edition series. There were other editors who shared their volumes with us, and I don't know if you've ever looked at the Norton Critical Edition. This is one of the most recent of their texts. Usually they're not recent texts. texts. They're much older. They're not 20th century texts. So it was interesting to look at the other texts on Darwin and Jacob Riis and look at the differences between what they had and what we did. But the goal of this really was about teaching. It was really to make the volume useful for a college student. And it's the first annotated volume of Friedan's work with supporting primary and secondary sources. So we really wanted to make this accessible to instructors looking to provide an accessible, comprehensive, and interesting volume that captured a moment of intellectual and cultural social history of the mid-20th century. So it was about Friedan, but we really wanted it to go beyond Friedan, really about the world that she lived in, so that this would be very useful to a lot of college professors. We used the standard organization of other Norton volumes. We organized it by the text, primary sources, and secondary sources, and they're called texts, contexts, and scholarship. And so that's the organization that we used in the organization of this talk as well. Even though I had already published on Friedan, we decided that rather than doing a new scholarly approach, which some of the Norton Critical Editions did, we decided to use the volume to showcase the most important and most recent scholarship on Friedan, and really on the feminine mystique. We wanted to keep the focus on the work itself, and its value as an intellectual treatise on women's position in the 1950s, as well as a window into the historical moment of the turn of the 60s, a phrase we'd used a bit thanks to our colleague, Anna Pegler-Gordon. We were very well aware that when Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique is usually mentioned, it is to state that the publication of the book started second wave feminism. And certainly the book did create a huge stir. Friedan went on to help create Now in 1966, and that all lends credence to this assertion that it sort of started second wave feminism. But we really wanted to understand the volume separately from the start of the women's movement and Betty Friedan's personal activism in it. We wanted to present the text as an important document of intellectual history, and Friedan as a mid-20th century public intellectual. How we organized thematically and chronologically was our way to delineate influences on Friedan and her work on the volume as distinct from the influence that the volume had on the incipient women's movement.
We had quite a few sort of historiographical and intellectual influences in developing this work. And we did just spend a lot of time talking about how we were going to approach it and whose works we liked and what they offered and how we were going to go from there. Daniel Horowitz's work on the making of the feminine mystique was very influential in our thinking. His painstaking research into Friedan's activities within the progressive labor, popular front world in the late 1940s and 1950s in New York City influenced our thinking, particularly in light of recent scholarship that's come up in women's labor history and in women's history on the quote-unquote other women's movement, a book by Dorothy Sue Cobble, for example, which complicates the story about the origins of second wave feminism and about the whole wave metaphor to begin with. So we were very influenced by that as Horowitz's book worked with those new works of scholarship coming out. These more recent works on feminism in the left before the 1960s helped us to understand the intellectual currents that were influencing Friedan when she was living in New York City in the 50s. Another important piece, which fortuitously came out as we were working on the volume, was Louis Menon's piece in the New Yorker magazine entitled "Books as Bombs: Why the Women's Movement Needed the Feminine Mystique." And it was just amazing. You know, I think I called you and said, "Oh, you have to read this article." And it wasn't revelatory. It was just confirming of a lot of the things that we were already working on. It explored Friedan's work alongside Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, Michael Harrington's The Other America, Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed, and he argued that, quote, books were bombs at that particular historic moment in American history, and that all of these books were formative for larger social movements that would come into their own later in the decade. And we really liked that sort of comparison, and we liked that rendering of the historical moment. This articulated in a very smart and accessible way our thinking about approaching this piece as both as a scholarly work and a manifesto of sorts. And finally, Stephanie Kuntz's work on the ongoing impact of the feminine mystique, even today, also provided important insights. Kuntz's work demonstrates that the feminine mystique was certainly a catalyst in its day, but it also has more enduring qualities that take it outside of its immediate historical context as well. And that was something that was talked about quite a bit this morning. A brilliant and complicated person like Friedan drew from multiple disciplines and intellectual currents. In our primary source section, we did our best to capture that richness and complexity. And so we started our work.
All right, so our first task was to do something that had not been done before, to annotate the text of the Feminine Mystique. It is a very long book, and that took a while. Because we intended this to be of use in the college classroom, we decided the best way to proceed was to have actual college students read the book and highlight terms, phrases, and references that they did not understand. We had 3 bright undergraduates do this, and it was pretty shocking.
I love them, but it was shocking.
It was shocking. It really was. It really surprised us a lot. No, what they didn't understand, what they were not familiar with. Yeah, it was really surprising to us. But the 3 were fairly consistent. So we believe that we identified what would be most challenging to understand for college-age readers. So we hired with the thanks of NYU and MSU. Sorry, yeah, I know, I'm regressing. MSU and the history department, we hired 2 students, 1 graduate student and an undergraduate, to research the terms in reputable finding aids, encyclopedias, and reference sources. They Xeroxed the information, placed them in binders, and we met about these multiple times. We then read through the work ourselves with the intention of, with the intention of identifying the terms we thought actually needed to be explained. So, Hausfrau needed to be explained. Marital coitus, we decided they could look up. Right? Yeah. There was a lot of that.
We argued about that.
I know we did, actually. After all this, and you should look through the annotations, just check them out, just to see. They're very interesting. After all of this, we had a very long list. We divided up the work of writing the actual annotations. Lisa got all the women, I got all the psychology. We then went over all the annotations collectively, editing and rewriting each other's entries several times. And this all sounds very matter-of-fact and very nuts and bolts. It was a really painstaking and sometimes a difficult process, but it was gratifying. We worked together really well, and because we did this first, the process gave us a very intimate, maybe too intimate, knowledge of the text. Okay.
So I was primarily responsible for the section on contexts. I did contexts. Kirsten primarily did scholarship, but we obviously did the work and then we shared it with the others, so it was really a collective effort. There were a few organizing themes that both Kirsten and I discussed before we set out on the work. First, we wanted the context section to give equal weight to intellectual influences on FRIEDAN and the work, as well as the impact that the work had after publication. We wanted to present these in thematic sections, presented chronologically, and we wanted to these sections to roughly correspond to the sections on scholarship to follow. So the book had a certain coherence about it. These documents selected needed to be short, accessible, and not too expensive to acquire and to reproduce. And you should know there were some things we didn't include because they were too expensive. I mean, it was just a very basic sort of, economical issue. Norton said, you want to...
Time Magazine.
Yeah, Kirsten's going to out them.
Oh, no.
Time Magazine is a very bad magazine to excerpt from. They're very expensive. But other places seem to be okay. So that was part of the consideration process as well. So the context section had 3 parts. Do I have it up there? Origins and influences. And I'm going to go. The second part was the turn of the 60s, which is this phrase that we used to capture sort of that historical moment. And then the third one was impact, all right? And I'm going to go back, and this seems to work really well, and talk about them. I'm not going to go through them, one by one in great detail, but I just want to highlight a few things. So in A, which was origins and influences, we set out to establish the specific background and community in which FRIEDAN was born and grew up in, an upper middle-class Jewish girl growing up in the Midwest. We selected certain of her writings, both creative and journalistic, from her time at Smith College, but also writings of those who influenced her intellectually while she was there. So we included writings that we learned were formative in her thinking while she was at school. So there's an excerpt from Frederick Engels on the origins of the family, private property, and the state. As well as writings from a professor that she had in humanistic psychology with whom she worked during a summer. So all the different sort of intellectual currents and individuals that were formative in her intellectual growth and thinking. Both the sections on momism and popular front feminism reflect Friedan's time in New York City, working in the labor press, as well as a young mother. We included parts of an article that Friedan wrote about female electrical workers, when she was working for the labor press, for example, who were seeking equal pay and equal treatment, as well as an excerpt from Farnham and Lumberg's popular Modern Women, the Lost Sex, a popular sort of pop psychology book, which was denouncing women's entrance into the labor force in the modern era, to sort of showcase what I like to see as sort of that dissonance of the 1950s. Right, the actual day-to-day lived experiences of these women in the Electrical Workers Union asking for equal pay and equal rights, while the popular culture is signaling that women shouldn't be in the labor force at all. And I, because I'm a labor historian, included a chart of women's labor force participation trends in the 20th century to show that the secular trend was of increasing female labor force participation. Again, providing sort of an insight into that dissonance, but also a corrective to the myth of the 50s happy housewife. And I'm just going to mention this now, and Kirsten's going to bring this up later. All of this is also supported by scholarship that's tending to and focusing on these very issues in the recent work that's being done on the Feminine Mystique and Betty Friedan. Okay, so that's that. So then the second section on the turn of the 60s is our effort to contextualize the historical moment in which the book appeared. And this we thought might be of use for faculty who want to use it for a general US survey, right? And have this be the book that serves for the insights into the women's movement. So there are standard documents here such as the Equal Pay Act of 1963, Martin Luther King's speech, I Have a Dream speech from 1963, an excerpt from the Port Huron Statement of 1962, and it turned out everything happened in 1963, after all, as well as less conventional documents that are included in this time period, and this is one of particular appeal to me, a selection from Helen Gurley Brown's 1962 bestseller, Sex and the Single Girl, which was almost as probably more popular than Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique in the day. So this section in particular, we hoped would be of use to a more general class, as I said, and provide documents that would serve the instructor's efforts in broadening beyond the text itself. And then finally, in the third section on impacts, there were three themes, and you have to know this is the one that we had the most discussions about impacts. It was more challenging, and I think the conversation this morning reflects the nature of those challenges. First, we wanted to provide documents about the reception of the book in its time. So here we primarily relied on letters that were written to Friedan or to the editors of McCall's magazine where the book had been excerpted in advance. We featured a small sampling, just really 3 or 4 letters, of the positive as well as the negative responses to her book. Second, we wanted to describe the ways in which the publication of the book served as a launching point for activism for both feminism, for Friedan herself, as well as was formative for feminism in the United States. So both her personal launching point into activism as well as the larger movement itself. We featured, for example, and here this is just a very small sampling, Pauli Murray's account of the formation of NOW, as well as Bella Abzug's account of the creation of the National Women's Political Caucus. There are voices from the various women's liberation movements included, as these various groups challenged and critiqued Friedan or took the movement to places that Friedan never intended or support. So for example, one of my favorites is a piece about the politics of housework by Pat Minardi. Some of you may be familiar with it, which just takes to the ultra extreme, the analysis about how housework can never be inherently gratifying type of labor. But this was done by a so-called women's liberationist, but it's really dealing with some of the same themes that Friedan brings up in her book. So, for example, we have selections as well from feminists on the left who disagreed with Friedan's stance on sexual politics and how this got resolved in the Women's Convention in Houston in 1977. Right-wing conservative women saw Friedan as a symbol of the women's movement, obviously a negative symbol, and we included a selection from Phyllis Schlafly to represent that perspective. And she mentions her by name, so that's the one we picked. We even included a selection from Susan Faludi, who was also mentioned this morning, her book Backlash about the 1980s, in which Faludi critiques Friedan's positions on women in the family in the 1980s. describing Friedan's ideas as part of the larger backlash against feminism in that decade. So a much more critical assessment of Friedan's journey after the book was written. And finally, we finished with so-called third-wave feminists like Jennifer Baumgartner, Amy Richards, and Naomi Wolf, who specifically mentioned Friedan as formative in their feminist ideas and practice, and so we end with them. So Friedan somewhat minimally restored, right, as an important formative foremother of the women's movement. We undoubtedly did not include the full range of impacts this book has had since its publication, but we hope that we were able to convey something of the sweep and the scope of this impact, response, and influence that it had on many quarters since it was published. I will do that.
Thank you. Okay. And then I worked on this scholarship. That was my responsibility, to do this scholarship. And to put together this section on the literature, on the feminine mystique, was really humbling. I had not been actively working on Friedan for about at least 5 years. And so it was impressive and striking how many new historians had interpreted Friedan in different ways. I was struck as well by how the categories of scholarship differed from the other categories we had been using for the primary text. So our goal initially had been to have them mirror one another. But when I sat down to look at the scholarship and categorize it, it was interesting to see, initially they were supposed to match so students and faculty could weave seamlessly back and forth between the materials, finding the primary sources represented in the secondary literature. So we made as much effort as we could to link the scholarship to the documents, but what impressed me was how the secondary literature really had a life of its own, how scholars explored questions that went beyond our expectations and categories, which is good, and the discussion this morning pushed things even further, which to me was really fantastic. To some extent, those categories were chronological, so we examined origins and the moment and impact. But they were also thematic, as so many historians had asked questions about the text itself, and particularly about Friedan's work as a historian. So the section on origins addressed Friedan's personal, political, and intellectual origins, paying close attention to both the influences that Friedan openly acknowledged, as well as those that she carefully concealed. And that's been one of the major themes of the literature on Friedan, is her concealment. It features Sandra Dijkstra's piece on Simone de Beauvoir's unacknowledged influence on Friedan, as well as Joyce Antler's exploration of Friedan's Jewish background, and Daniel Horowitz's crucial article on Friedan's radical early years, when she was involved in Popular Front and left-wing labor journalism. These radical and Jewish elements of Friedan's background were kept far from the footnotes of the feminine mystique, and yet they were central to understanding the work. There were also origins in contemporary psychology, in existential humanism and momism, that Friedan was more willing to acknowledge, and so we feature selections by historians Ellen Herman and Rebecca Jo Plant to probe these origins in our text. With our section on the feminine mystique analyzing Betty Friedan as an historian, we address one of the most important ways that historians have considered Friedan in the past 30 years, as an historian, a public intellectual, whose influential analysis of women's lives in the 1930s, 1940s, and the 1950s shaped both historians and lay audiences' perspectives for years, and I think there was some reference to that this morning. Beginning in the 1990s, scholars like Joanne Meyrowitz, Eva Moskowitz, and Sylvie Murray began to question Friedan's portrait of female independence and autonomy in the years before World War II, as well as her portrait of a feminine mystique that constrained and limited women's options to marriage and domesticity in years after the war. In different ways, all of these historians have described a more complex and contradictory discourse on women's lives emerging after World War II, thus illustrating that Friedan's criticism of the 1950s domestic ideal was a part of her culture, as I believe was mentioned earlier today, not entirely outside of it. So the flaws of the feminine mystique, the limitations of it, as these historians all note, we thought actually offered a valuable window onto the complicated role of women in the United States in the post-World War II era. One of the central arguments of this text, of our text, was that the feminine mystique was part of a crucial moment in US history, and we've been saying this a lot, the years at the end of the 1950s and the beginning of the 1960s, the turn of the 1960s, which witnessed tremendous political, cultural, and intellectual ferment. The civil rights movement and the peace movements and growing visibility sparked excitement among activists on the left and worries among activists on the right. And so in this section, we reproduce excerpts from Louis Menand, who we've mentioned, Jennifer Scanlon, and me, that place Friedan alongside other public intellectuals of the moment, and the feminine mystique alongside other major books of the moment that gave new voice to new political, cultural, and social movements. And then finally, our section on the impact and legacy of the Feminine Mystique notes the controversy that the text engendered in Jessica Weiss's piece on housewives on the right in the 1960s. The Feminine Mystique's impact on the women's movement in the mid-1960s. So we included Ruth Rosen's piece on the formation of Now. And then the book's legacies for women today in Stephanie Kuntz's text. Returning to Friedan 15 years after I first started to research her work, I have been struck by how much more there is to say about her celebrity status in American feminism and her impact in American political movements and culture. I feel as though sort of 20 years ago, scholars focused on Friedan as an historian, and 10 years ago as a radical. And even given our conversation this morning, I sort of feel like in the next 10 or 20 years, we might consider her a celebrity, someone who's sort of a lightning rod, sort of this image that has sort of, that transfixed a lot of people. And I think it's a really fascinating place to go, to ponder sort of the meaning of her status as a celebrity in the women's movement. And I do think that the most recent and often the freshest work now is being done about the reception of Friedan's work by both the right and the left. And so as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of this text, I think focusing on the legacy and impact is really a huge question that people already, I think, are asking, and I think would be interesting to have more conversation about.
So what we would like to conclude today's discussion is by reading the last bits of our introduction. So nothing as wonderful as Betty Friedan's words. These are going to be ours, meager words in comparison. And what we'd like to do is to do this with a very unusual and personal backdrop. As many of you know who've published your own books, you don't always get the cover that you want. And this was certainly no exception for us. You all saw the cover that we got, which was, oh goodness, this picture of Betty Friedan. Which is a very standard, often used photograph of her with the book featured right there in the front on the table. And she's sitting in a very, grand and, lovely public celebrity sort of way, exactly. And this was by no means our first, second, or even third choice. Because it didn't, it's from the 70s, it's much after, many years after the book was published, and so we didn't think this represented exactly what we had in mind. So we're going to show you the cover that we wanted. The cover that we wanted was this. This is a wonderful photograph by Dion Arbus that she took in New York City in 1955. And that's the title, New York City, 1955. And I don't know if you can see it very well. This is the reject, one that we had on a JPEG, so it didn't reproduce very well. But we loved this photograph as a representation of the feminine mystique, right, as exemplified by this woman who was trapped, right, who was stuck, who was frozen in a particular moment and place, and obviously with men on either side of her. Hemming her in. Sorry? No, this is not her at all. This is just a woman that Dion Arbus photographed on the streets of New York in 1955, right? So in addition to the sort of Mad Men, evocation that we thought that this might help bring sales to the book, we thought that it represented the time that the book was representing itself, right? The sort of the image, the feeling, the tension, what? Ambivalence. The ambivalence, right, that women that she was trying to represent might have felt. So we'll keep this up as we read to you how we ended the introduction to our introduction to the text. So after Friedan died in 2006, many obituaries highlighted her significance as a feminist icon and a feminist crusader, the woman who, quote, almost single-handedly revived the feminist movement, a leader of one of the most influential and successful social movements of the 20th century. These plaudits are mostly true, and they are crucial to understanding Friedan's historical significance. We believe that there are other crucial, less noticed ways of understanding the historical significance of Betty Friedan's life and her text. The Feminine Mystique, her text, The Feminine Mystique. Friedan was one of the major public intellectuals of the 20th century, someone who took the complicated and jargon-laden ideas of psychologists economists and political theorists and translated them in the Feminine Mystique into powerful, readable, relatable prose that touched millions of people and convinced them to think and act differently.
As a public intellectual whose lifetime spanned much of the 20th century, moreover, FRIEDAN offers an important window into the history of that century. Her work indicates for us the ways that feminism was interconnected with the struggles of working class men and women, with Black and Jewish battles against racism and anti-Semitism, with the efforts of the peace movement to oppose war and eradicate nuclear weapons, and finally, even with the fears and anxieties of the conservative movement, as ideas about traditional female roles changed. The Feminine Mystique also shows us that those social movements all had a long and continuous history throughout the 20th century. FRIEDAN may have revitalized the women's movement, but she did not create it anew. If timing is everything, Betty Friedan had it all. The Feminine Mystique appeared at just the right moment to take advantage of the ideological work of the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s from first-wave feminists, unionists, socialists, and communists, psychologists, and Jewish and Black political activists, while riding the first swell of the second wave of the feminist movement. As a result, the Feminist Mystique had substantial impact on a wide range of political activists, thinkers, and ordinary individuals. Betty Friedan thus continues to leave us all a legacy of political thought and activism for generations to come. We can do the rest of this stuff. Should we end there? We have a little bit more. So we promised you that was an ending. We're going to do it. We're going to do like one of those movies where you think it's done, and yeah. All right. So the final thing, we just have a few things to say about our collaboration. We want to encourage more people to collaborate because we found this to be an incredibly productive and nourishing experience with many more pleasure than we anticipated. We live only a mile from one another. Our offices were next door to each other. We met regularly over coffee and breakfast and lunch, and that work would fall into a rhythm of friendship and productivity that belied the solitary nature of most academic work. And it felt really special to be doing it with a woman who hired me. We were lucky to have worked out a work process that fit with our own unique and peculiar ways of work. Lisa is an organizer and a planner who is allergic to last-minute work, and I like to edit first drafts and always get things done at the last minute, but never later. It's always on time. We did not kill one another, and so we made one another stronger. And so we'll say that we also found, as we were doing this, that it's interesting that Sheryl Sandberg came up in the conversation this morning because we were asked to speak about this earlier in this year, and I wound up looking into a lot of Sheryl Sandberg stuff because it was in the news, and we talked about it a lot. So we decided to write a piece on Sandberg's Lean In and Friedan's Feminine Mystique. Did you put it up? Yep, there it is. It's up. So the New York Times didn't want it, but Ms. Blog did. And we really were struck. It's interesting in some ways, and I think a lot of the conversation could be that Friedan is not a Susan Sandberg, but a Sheryl Sandberg. But I do think it's really striking that Sheryl Sandberg is using Friedan, and we found a lot of similarities in the ways that they combine, that they speak individually but have eyes to the social, as we discussed earlier, and that's really what the piece is about. So working on this together made us realize not only that collaborative partnerships are resources to engage when needed, but also that Friedan's legacy will undoubtedly give us many more opportunities to do so in the future, and we're very glad for that. So thank you, and we look forward to any comments that you have or questions. So.
Wondering if you could address some of the issues of today, of contemporary feminism, and what we still need to resolve. I understand the impact of Betty Friedan, and I'm very much in touch with Sheryl Sandberg's ideas. But I'm wondering what's being done about wage inequality. I mean, women still only make 77 cents on the average for what a man makes. And also, other issues of women's reproductive rights. That there's a tremendous backlash against women, and it manifests itself in reproductive rights and that sort of thing, and overturning Roe versus Wade. And I'm very concerned about that for my grandchildren and perhaps my great-grandchildren. So I'm wondering if you could address those issues and talk about what you feel are the current issues in addition to that, as well as that, and what you see needs to be accomplished and how it can be accomplished. And I know that's a lot to deal with, in the remaining.
I'd like to know that answer to all those questions. Can you tell us?
In 2 minutes?
Right, I think we need Betty Friedan. She needs to come back and help us. Do you want to start?
I'm an historian. Don't ask me questions like that. I only deal with the old things, right? Read the book. I think that we certainly had an eye to a lot of those concerns and those issues as we did it. And as I say, sort of seeing how she was treated in the 50th anniversary, seeing that there was a flurry of articles that did connect her work to issues of the day, to issues about abortion, to issues about work-life balance, maternity leave. Actually, Stephanie Kuntz was on NPR right during the 50th anniversary and had some fantastic, and put stuff in the New York Times also about maternity leave throughout the world. And the United States, I think, is like last, right? It's tied with like two
No,
other
we're next to
countries as
Sri
last.
Lanka and Burma.
Yeah.
It's the United States, Sri Lanka, and Burma are the only countries that don't have some form of paid leave for parents.
Yeah, absolutely. So, pardon? Exactly. So I do think, I think that putting this out there does encourage people to talk about it, right? And putting it out there for your students encourages your students to talk about it. So like the speakers this morning, when I speak with my students about Betty Friedan and the Feminine Mystique, they will bring up contemporary issues about work-life balance or about abortion or things like that. So I do think that just putting it out there, even though this is a historical treatment, I think that encouraging people to think about the history encourages them to connect to these older issues. And the fact that she has become kind of an icon makes it, I think, more respectable, makes it more possible to talk about. So I think that would be how I would answer that.
Right, and I would just want to add one of the things that, one of the reasons we were motivated to do the piece about Sandberg was because of the echoes of so many similarities. Both the critiques of her work. She's not talking about real working women. She's not talking about African American women. She's only talking about women in the most elite forms of employment in the United States and who takes care of her children. And the very things that people have brought up since the book was written about the feminine mystique. So we were struck by that. So it's an agenda. We thought, here's a renewed agenda. Whether or not you like the book or not, these are issues that are still unresolved, that still need to be worked out, that women still feel, and men still feel very passionately about. And whether or not you like it, the fact that it's bringing it to the fore, it's bringing it to the conversation on a national scale. Lean In was on the bestseller list for weeks and weeks and weeks, so it's obviously been paid attention to. That we consider that a good thing, right? We consider that airing those kinds of issues, good or bad, is helpful. It's moving things forward. So that was the other issue.
Yes, I'm Sheila O'Reilly, and I'm wondering what Betty Friedan's father and husband thought of her feminism and what they did for a living.
Okay.
Father
So,
was a jeweler.
yes, her father was a jeweler. He died. He passed away before she became a prominent feminist.
Still in graduate school.
Yeah, it was actually a pretty formative thing for her, his death. And they had a very complicated kind of relationship. Her husband, we were actually just talking about this during the break. Her husband was not enthralled at all with her feminism or her experiences. He would call her friends lesbians. He was, as an insult. He was very unhappy about it, and they divorced, I believe, in '67. I'd have to look up the date, but not long after the publication. And he worked in advertising, I believe. He did media work. He started doing theater stuff, and then it moved into media and advertising. But I do think that there was a great deal of. They were probably a mismatch, but also I think that her work in feminism probably put a burden on the marriage, and he was not an enlightened man to continue the conversation from the morning.
I had a question. I really loved your presentation and the idea of putting the book together that way. And I'm very curious about the annotations, and you just kind of went over that really quickly. But it seems to me that those references are really crucial in understanding the book itself. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, were there any, sort of categories of references or groups of annotation that you had to make that you think really reveal some things about then and now?
Right, right. There were, and this was the source of, there wasn't disagreements, but just conversations on how to handle it. So there were some basic factual things that needed to be covered. FRIEDAN has a fantastic chapter on women's history. And none of our students knew any of those people. You know, they didn't know Susan B. Anthony, Angela, you know, they didn't know any of the names. They didn't know any of the organizations. They didn't know any of the historical background. So some of it was just simply identifying those points that were unclear or unknown and providing that historical background. There was also a lot of individuals in humanistic psychology. And here, that's why Kirsten said she took care of it because she knows that those works much better. But there also, to summarize in 2 to 3 sentences, Bruno Bettelheim, you know, something along those lines. It's very, very challenging trying to explain what students might need to know to understand about him so they can understand what she's trying to say in that particular part of the text. And you should add some, but the last thing I want to mention is that there were parts in the text where she described historical currents or events or things that were going on at the time that are not specific terms or phrases or people that we felt we needed to provide some background on. The one we were talking about earlier was her sections on homosexuality. So the students didn't necessarily highlight anything about that, although they might have been appalled when they read it. But we felt when we went through those parts like that, that we needed to provide some contextualization for why she was saying the things that she was doing. Again, not to necessarily, you know, to support it or denounce it, but just to, this is why we think, this was the information, this was the science at the time that she was drawing on to explain the stance that she was taking. So there was some contextualizing. She goes on a rant, for example, about beatniks also. You know, she has these little pet peeves about things. And so, you know, I don't think they knew what beatnik was anyway.
They did not.
They didn't know what that was. So we had to explain what a beatnik was, but then we had to explain why she didn't like them, right? So there were those sorts of categories of things as well that went into a little bit more depth about the time period. So there's others.
And actually, just to follow on the beatnik thing, I mean, the interesting thing about that, right, is that we had to both explain what it was, right, but also like why she, you know, like sort of the, not really what it was, but what people thought it was, right? So there's a little bit of that sort of, not just what it is, but also, right, exactly what people thought, you know. I mean, you know, if you want to be shocked, like, you know, pop culture to me was the most fascinating thing. They didn't know any of the movie stars. I mean, they didn't know, like, I mean, she has a whole list of, you know, she does these things with images of women, you know, that, you know, there's, you know, images in the 40s and then there's the 50s, the difference between Doris Day and Betty Grable, right? Or no, or
Katharine Hepburn.
Katharine Hepburn, right? The differences between maybe Katharine Hepburn and Doris Day meant nothing to them. I mean, so I had to sit there, you know, with no images and try to sort of conjure up the, you know, the images of each of these movie stars, which was really fascinating. To me, that was sort of it was fun, but it was also hard. I mean, it was hard in a way that I wouldn't have expected or really thought about doing. Yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question. It was a very interesting process.
Hi, my name is Joanne Schlichter, and this is a question for Kirsten. I discovered when looking at some of the contemporary articles on the 50th anniversary that I wasn't the only person who was absolutely appalled when she compared women in the feminist mystique to people in the concentration camp. Mm-hmm. So my ears perked up when I heard that you included a chapter on her in your book, and I just wondered if you could talk about that for a little bit.
Sure, really briefly, yeah, because I actually, yeah, I could go on for a long time and you don't want that. So what I do, what I talk about in her doing it, I put her in a context of the moment where there are actually a lot of Jews, or at least a good number of Jewish intellectuals, who are doing sort of similar things. And it does sound shocking to our ears today. And this is really sort of a place where I think historians can do something good. You know, they can take, you know, go back in time and actually look at a moment and really chart how different it is, right? So you know, she got no criticism from Jews, from Holocaust survivors. She got no criticism for calling the suburban home a comfortable concentration camp. The narrative, our understanding and narrative of the concentration camps and the Holocaust as something unique and incomparable is something that was produced. It was constructed in the later 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. It wasn't inherent. It wasn't natural. And so at this moment, other Jews, Stanley Elkins, Stanley Milgram, found it productive to make connections between the horrors of the camps and political problems in America, slavery, racism, the Vietnam War, things like that, nuclear proliferation. There were connections there that they wanted to make for liberal political purposes. She had particular influences, Jewish psychologists Bruno Bettelheim and Kurt Lewin. Bettelheim was at that point not seen in the way that he is today. He wasn't criticized at that point. He was still an expert. He was a survivor himself. He had a great deal of authenticity. So what most of the people I look at, and what FRIEDAN was certainly doing, was taking sort of the contemporary scholarship that talked about the camps as places that were dehumanizing, and then trying to understand dehumanization in an American context. So it was not as shocking then. And you know, sort of, I encourage people to kind of move back in a moment when there was something productive about it. It didn't last. She stopped talking about the comfortable concentration camp pretty early because she got criticism for it in a later moment. But at that particular moment, it had meaning for her and for other people, and she was not attacked or shamed or anything like you might expect. Thank you for the question.
I'm Sue Ellen Hoy, and I'm simply curious why you didn't get the cover you wanted. What were the arguments against it?
It was the Arbus estate.
Not only though.
It was partly them.
It
They
wa-
didn't want to use it for commercial purposes.
Right. I mean, it was partly Arbus, but also, I mean, we went through a lot of work. I mean, Lisa in particular went through a lot of work looking for things, and then they brought it to the board, and the board just wanted. To me, this is why I sort of think it's interesting to think about FRIEDAN as a celebrity, because the board just wanted an image of FRIEDAN. They basically gave us, by the end, after we had done all kinds of searching, we chose all kinds of biographical photos. We went back and found all kinds of photos of her, when it turned out they just wanted a photo of her, but they really just wanted one of two iconic shots of FRIEDAN at a later date. That was all they wanted. And I don't know why that is, but I do think it is about sort of name recognition and celebrity. I'm not sure, but that was what they wanted. I mean, not getting the Arbus was that, but
Right, we had a lot of other counter proposals that we thought were better at capturing that historical moment of the 1950s. And that's really what we were aiming for. But clearly the editors at Norton, who we loved working with, they were fantastic.
They were great.
Yeah.
This is not to criticize them. They
Right.
gave us whatever we wanted, and they were terrific.
Right. In this particular case, they obviously had a very specific vision, which conformed much more to what they imagined the public would want about a book about FRIEDAN, I think.
Right.
Right? Is that?
Yeah. And I just add, I don't even think it was the editors. I mean, they brought it to the board, and the board was the one that ultimately sort of nixed everything else and insisted. So it wasn't even the editors. I think it was a higher up decision.
Thank you. I'm Peggy Sullivan. I'm curious to know whether you worked from just the first edition and whether there were changes in later editions, what the nature of that might have been or how that would have affected your work.
Yeah. Yeah, we did. We worked from the first edition, and we tried to stick as closely as possible to that and the notes and all of the original materials. There have been a lot of, I want to be able to see her. Hi. There were a lot of, as you know, additions that came later, but we went to the original source. It was owned by Norton, and that's why we used the original. And in fact, I'm just remembering, the actual original cover that we wanted to use was the original 1963 cover, which just has the Feminine Mystique letters with a sort of a mirror pattern. And they did away with it, partly because it didn't conform to the Norton Critical Edition template, right? But that was our original, one of our very first meetings, let's use the original cover, and use the original book. But that didn't work out either.
So you want to talk about the fact that we didn't have a computer document?
Yeah, go ahead, you can talk.
This is a totally nuts and bolts thing, but it's kind of interesting. They didn't give us a computer. They did not actually have a computer document. We had to work with hard copy, and I think that's because it was a first edition. I think nobody ever bothered to just sit and retype it into the computer, so we actually had to work with hard copies during this entire thing. Nobody ever made it into an actual word processing document, which was kind of interesting.
Right, so and I just want to add one more anecdote, which was a source of a little bit of conversation between us. When we excerpted things, for example, Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex,
This was interesting.
we also made a conscious effort to excerpt the edition that FRIEDAN herself would have read. Because that went through many editions and different translations.
Yeah.
So we went back to the original one that we were reasonably sure that she would have read. So we were very mindful of making sure everything was from the original time frame. Yeah.
Can I also just jump in with a question? Lisa, you talked about reading the FRIEDAN canon when you first got involved with this project and actually being quite compelled by her later material. And since it came up as a question earlier this morning, I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about that. It's not work that I know myself.
The Fountain of Age?
Right. So, or the relationship between what comes later for her.
Yeah, I mean, that's the one that struck me the most. She frequently got grants and awards to do research, to be at universities, to be in residence, to teach students. She was as much a scholar, in her later years as anything else. And the Fountain of Age was a result of some of those scholarly, and it was discussed this morning, activities that she did. And it's a huge book. It's incredibly referenced and researched. And it has an amazing, compelling thesis, which is about the ways in which old people are undervalued. It is the feminine mystique for senior citizens. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. I was blown away by it in a way that I did not expect to be. And I think it's really underrated. And I don't understand, I think it's a completely valid hypothesis and a very compelling book, but obviously didn't have the same sort of play. So it just struck me of her power as an intellect and as a writer.
Yeah. One additional thing. The other thing to think about, I think that's interesting, is the way that she was able to take her personal experiences and sort of, deepen them with, substantial scholarly work and interviews, the way that she took her own concerns and broadened them out. And I think that reflects that too. So.
I'm Penelope Bingham, and I'm pretty sure that I read the first edition in 1964. And it had not occurred to me to think about later editions. And I understand completely your choosing to focus on the first edition. Were there noteworthy, interesting changes in
Not to
later
the original
editions?
text, there were lots of additional intros. She would write a new intro when it came out in '73 or when it came out in the '80s. And then they would also ask, usually journalists or other noteworthy feminists to write prefaces or other preparatory materials. So it was interesting, later editions of it, it just sort of accumulates. So we just stripped it, we took all that stuff away. We didn't use any of that.
Were they interesting? I talk about cookbooks, and what I focus on often are the prefaces, which
Right.
tell you what you're supposed to do as a woman. And the preface and the introduction and the comments are really often pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. We kept her preface from '59. We kept the initial preface, the original one, right, which was really fascinating. We did not include, so for the 10th anniversary, I believe it was, she included her own sort of reminiscences about the women's movement. I don't even know that this was our choice. I think that this was Norton's choice, honestly. I don't know that they...
We could have included it as a document.
We could have, it's true, we didn't even think about that. That would have been a good thing to include. Yeah, we did. I didn't actually think about it. They were very rich. They were frequently sort of descriptions of her experiences in the women's movement. And I think that Norton wanted this to be about the text. And we sort of took it as that because of our concern with situating it in the middle of the century in the way that we did. But it's a really interesting question. And we did keep the original preface.
Right, and we had other materials. We have excerpts from her, It Changed My Life,
Right.
other things that would have done the same sort of work and signaled where she was later and what her reflections were. Right. So maybe we didn't think it was as necessary to do that.
Right,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, we'll take a few more, and then we'll take a little break and before our afternoon panel.
I just want to say this has been fascinating to hear about your process and what you've done, and I was not familiar with the Norton series, and this is just wonderful, and I thank the organizers for thinking of you and including you in this presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.